Well, on behalf of the Oral History Program at Jackson Library and GSB Marketing and Communications, I'd like to welcome you today to this event honoring the career and legacy of Lee Bach. Aside from his distinguished career at Stanford, it's now generally recognized that Lee Bach was a central figure in the worldwide transformation of business education in the 20th century. As his memorial resolution at Stanford read, he was a giant. His influence on business education was and seems likely to remain without equal. We're here today to honor that legacy. My name is Paul Rice. I'm associated with Jackson Library and the Oral History Program at Jackson Library. And my co-conspirators today, who helped organize this event, are Kathy Long, the director of Jackson Library. Kathy, you want to there? And Kathy Castillo, who's Director of Publications and Web Content at the GSB. Unfortunately, Kathy Castillo is not available today due to circumstances beyond her control. I'm sure she's thinking warm thoughts. We're pleased you're all here. We're very pleased that members of the Bach family can join us today. Really great. Just a quick logistics note. Excuse me, come on in and sit down. Thank you. A quick logistics note, the restrooms are out this door to the right, down through the double doors at the end of the hall. So I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel today. R.J. Miller was Dean of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University from 1969 to 1979. Charles Horngren is the Edmund W. Littlefield Professor of Accounting Emeritus, and James Van Horn is the A.P. Giannini Professor of Banking and Finance Emeritus. And they're all very distinguished in their own fields, and they're all friends and colleagues of Lee Bach. The panel will be moderated by Professor Van Horn, and we're hoping at some point that Dean Joss will be able to join us. He's got a commitment at the moment. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Dr. Van Horn.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. This is indeed a very important event in the history of Stanford Business School. I came to Stanford in 1965, just a year before Lee came, and I was in the dean's office as one of two academic deans under R.J. Miller. And during the decade of the 1970s, Lee had a profound impact upon the business school here at Stanford and many other things. With me, of course, is R.J. Miller, the fourth dean of the Graduate School of Business, and Chuck Horngren, eminent and really highly respected accounting professor nationally. Lee Bach, as I said, came to Stanford in 1966, 2 years, having visited really Stanford 2 years before and having made a decision to come here. And as Paul indicated, he was founding dean of the Graduate School of Industrial Administration at Carnegie Institute of Technology, it was known at that time, really a giant in managerial education. And with us this morning as well is Jim Marsh, who was on the faculty at the Graduate School of Industrial Administration at Carnegie. Retiring from Stanford in 1983, he had really a profound impact on the business school, as well as more broadly. And we hope to bring out some of this in our discussion and fill out a canvas, hopefully, of a picture of this very remarkable man. So I'd like to begin with RJ. Lee Bach chaired the search committee that not only offered you the job, but he also actively recruited you for the job. So I'd like to ask you to start off and give your impressions, if you could, RJ.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, all. I want to make 2 points this morning. First, Lee Bach changed my life. And secondly, any success the business school may have enjoyed during the 10 years I was here could not have been accomplished without the contribution of Lee. I want to thank Paul for arranging this session this morning so it gives me an opportunity to expand on these 2 points. Let me also add, I'm very pleased that so many members of Lee's family are here today. You can hear firsthand from the people that knew your father well what a giant he really was. Let me start a little personal history. Growing up, I always thought I wanted to be a teacher. And at the time World War II came along, I was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley. I finished all the academic requirements, passed the exams, and was busy writing my doctoral dissertation when I got a penny postcard in the mail from my draft board congratulating me that I'd been selected to serve in the Army Air Forces. I went in as a private, got through officer candidate school, and by the time the war was over, was a planning officer in the Pentagon. A turning event, Henry Ford's picture appeared on Life magazine in October of 1946, just after the war was over. Henry Ford I was senile. His only son, Edsel, had died, and the Navy let Henry II out of the Navy so he could take over the family-controlled empire. It was in a real mess. During the war, they were even able to lose money on cost-plus contracts, and that takes some real skill. Almost out of cash and headed for bankruptcy. Things were quite a bit different 23 years later when I left. We had a cozy little oligopoly going. GM set high prices, Chrysler and Ford followed, and the profits rolled in. The auto industry was the most profitable industry. The auto executives were the best paid in America. Remember, at that time, there were no hedge funds, and banking was a dull and honest business. They hadn't yet dreamed up these exotic derivatives with enormous fees and outrageous salaries and bonuses that contributed. So that was I got a couple of notes here. We also paid our employees twice what the average pay in the U.S. was at that time, and had very generous health and pension benefits, and that's one of the things that led to the problems here today. But there were some clouds on the horizon. In 1967, there were riots in the city of Detroit. 12 full blocks of the city had burned up, and National Guard was called in. And some of us business leaders said, we'll go down and clean this situation up. So we raised a few $1 million, created something called the Economic Development Committee of Detroit. I was the chairman. We marched in. Complete failure. We didn't know what to do. We weren't the only city. There was riots in Watts in LA, and Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York. And so President Johnson, at the time, called a meeting of people, both academic and business, to see what should be done. So we all got together and decided we needed a new think tank. So we established the Urban Institute. I was the chairman the first 5 years. We had a budget of $8 million, and it's now going at $60 million, and I think the urban problems today are greater than they were when we set up the think tank. I know that they are worse in Detroit. In 1964, Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. The auto industry, he pointed out, was neglecting the safety problems. So the presidents of the automobile companies were called to Washington to testify under Senator Ribicoff. Again, we blew it. Didn't understand the political process or what to do. The result was a legislation, and the safety czar was appointed to regulate safety in the auto industry. A couple of years later, we did the same thing on clean air. We didn't know how to respond to that either. And so they passed legislation and controlled the emissions from automobiles. All this time, I kept up my interest in the academic, higher education especially. We built our home in Ann Arbor, which was home of the University of Michigan. We set up a discussion group that included the president of the university, the dean of the business school, some other deans, one or two business people. And also I went on the visiting committee of the Harvard Business School, also on the one that Lee Bach set up, the GSIA at Carnegie Mellon. And I was the founding chairman at the one at UCLA. So when Lee Bach called me in April of 1968 and offered me the deanship over the phone, I thought he had the authority. I guess he did, turned out later, and said he'd like to talk about it. I says, come on out. I had known Lee by reputation. First, when I was a member of the Brookings Board of Trustees in 1964, Bob Calkins, the chairman at the time, said he wanted to subsidize a book on inflation. It wanted to be a first-rate book, and the only person that could do that book was Lee Bach. And if he didn't get Lee to do it, he wouldn't have the book written. Now that impressed me. Secondly, one of the big problems of any head of an organization is hiring good people. Where do you find them? At that time at Ford, believe it or not, we had 425,000 employees, less than half that now. And we found, I kept track, we had 1,100 MBAs working at Ford and 2,200 undergraduates in business. And we found out that the MBAs came in at a 25% higher pay, but progressed at a 35% faster pace. So I had Lee come on out. He's a good persuader. It wasn't too long. I said I'd take the job at Stanford under 4 conditions. First, we would broaden their curriculum to include, so all the students would study something about the social process. And secondly, we would start a separate program, public management program, where we admit about 60 students directly into the public management program, which required the hiring of additional professors. What I got was Harry Rowan, who was the president of Rand Corporation, his fellow Rhodes Scholar, Alan Enthoven, even got George Schultz on a part-time basis. The second condition was I wanted tenure. I'd been around academic life long enough to know that tenure gives you prestige and clout. I thought I would need that. And then lastly, I wanted to hold the job for 15 months for 3 reasons. First, I wanted to make some organizational and managerial changes at Ford. Secondly, it gave me opportunity to come out to Stanford. I did several times and tried to learn something about the new job. And lastly, options. I wanted to hang around and pick up some more options because I knew I'd be taking over a 90% cut in pay and need a little more financial security. So Lee agreed to all those conditions, and his prestige was so great he carried along the search committee, the school, the chancellor, board of trustees, and I started to work in July 1, 1969. One of the first things I did was set up an advisory committee. It had 3 assistant profs, 3 associate profs, 3 full profs on a rotating basis, and 1 permanent member, Lee Bach. Secondly, to show Lee's clout, he was elected to the Senate to represent the business school in the Senate all the time. And I was asked to attend as a non-voting member to answer questions, and so was Dick Lyman and the other deans. But these meetings were very long and very boring. So I told Dick Lyman, who was the president, I'm not going to come anymore. If you got any questions with the business school, ask Lee Bach. He'll speak for the school and he'll commit the school just like I could. Another thing that he helped on was during the riots of April and May of 1970, the Vietnam War was on, and one day when the U.S. invaded Cambodia, all hell broke loose on campus. And, they even threw rocks through my window and knocked the picture over of my wife. The students went on strike, and Lee says, RJ, you ought to write a letter to the alumni and friends of the school to explain what's going on here. And I said, well, Lee, will you help? I said, it's a good idea. All his ideas were good ideas. And he said, well, I got to go to Washington tomorrow, but I'll dictate a few things tonight. So the next day before noon, his secretary brought in a 2-page, single-spaced letter, beautifully explaining the whole situation. And at the bottom it put, dictated but not read. All I had to do was remove that and send the letter out. I don't think anybody else that I know could have done that. I know I've seen Churchill, the last draft he sent to the printers was all marked up, and I understand Lincoln even had 3 or 4 drafts of the Gettysburg Address. But Lee dictated but not read. Imagine that. Especially I admire someone because I don't know how to write myself. Last thing I want to say how Lee helped is on a personal basis. He knew we wanted to live on campus till we could buy some land and build in Woodside. And he found out, as he always the first one to find out things, that the librarian at Stanford was going to Yale, and he'd have to sell his house. So he called me up, and I said, talk to Frances, and Frances says, well, have Ruth look at it. She had good judgment, as did Lee. So if Ruth likes it, we'll buy it. That happened in a matter of hours. We had our housing problem solved. Jim, I made these notes and talked longer than I meant to.
Not
but
at all,
I really did admire Lee Bach.
We'll circle back to you. I'd like now to have Chuck say a few words. Chuck came to Stanford roughly at the same time as Lee Bach. He chaired, that is Chuck, the Long Range Planning Committee in the late 1960s that called really for sweeping changes. Lee was a member, as I recall, of that committee, and these were the most sweeping changes for the next 40 years. So Chuck, perhaps you could talk about Lee's involvement with you upon this major reform of the curriculum and other things in the late 60s.
Well, I arrived here on a permanent basis in 1966, and Lee was a member of the Long Range Planning Committee that I chaired. It was set up by Ernie Arbuckle as dean, who felt that the whole school needed a thorough look. Well, we looked all right. We met every week throughout the academic year, starting at 6 o'clock and going until about 9 or 9:30, depending upon how much dispute we encountered. And Lee was, to nobody's surprise, a pivotal force in this. He has a style, or had a style, that I always admired, and I observed it in many contexts. For example, I've seen him teach several times, and I think the best way that I can express it is it's a Socratic cross-examination style, where he is always trying to get to the heart of the issues. And if we didn't get there, he persisted in getting to that core. And I felt that that cross-examination style just forces people to think much more deeply than they would otherwise. And I think that this was an enormous contribution, not only in a committee, but everywhere, in research, in classrooms, and throughout all faculty discussions. You could always count on him, sometimes just lying back in the weeds and coming out and pouncing with a central question that clarified things in many people's minds. He had that reputation before he came here, and he certainly lived up to it. I wrote to Bob Jedicke early last week, and I said we're going to have this session on Lee Bach. Do you have any comments or additions that might be noteworthy? And he responded, as always, in a thorough way, and basically said a lot of what I just said. But there was one passage in there that I thought the faculty in particular would enjoy, and I brought it with me, so let me just cite it for you. He said, "Every year, especially when I was associate dean, I probably used up more emotional energy than anyone could ever imagine to get ready for fireside chatting Lee Bach. It seemed like getting ready to meet with God. As great a man as Lee was, he really was never intimidating, and he could somehow always make you feel at ease. I would keep telling myself that somehow it didn't work too well until after the event." But that was a reputation that Lee enjoyed or suffered through his stay here. A lot of faculty had so much respect for him that they were afraid of him, and I think that was a mistake. He was not a fearful type of person. He had enormous breadth, and he had a passion for relevance. And one of his characteristics that I think all of us could learn as faculty members is he was a good citizen, not only of the school, but of the university as a whole. He played an active role in university-wide affairs, and he was always approachable to say yes. I have heard comments before, and I certainly agree with it, that if you want something done, ask the busiest person to do it. And typically, that's good advice, because somehow they're more efficient and they do get things done. And Lee certainly got things done. He also had a lot of energy with respect to improving the teaching of basic economics. He taught basic economics to undergraduates for years, and he sought worldwide improvement in basic economics courses and teaching. So the breadth of his views continue to amaze me as I reflect on it. And then there's one other thing that in my files I found, and this is especially for Lee's children. I have a note that I received from Ruth Bach, and I'll just read a passage of it, but this
You okay?
magazine, which some of you have seen, is selections. In spring of 1995, it's an extensive discussion of Lee Bach's career and personality, etc., and I recommend it to all. But I sent either a copy or a Xerox copy of this to Ruth, and Ruth responded, thanked me for sending it, and said, I'm going to quote this directly, and by all means, if one of you want this, get it after we break up. She says, the children have learned a lot more about him from this, and I have been taken back to happier times than his last few years. Thank you again. So on. Lee had tough times, had tough physical problems all the time he was here. And to think of all that he accomplished professionally in the face of serious Parkinson's disease that just wore him down over the years makes him even more an amazing man.
Thank you, Chuck, for that, and we'll circle back to the two of you shortly. As indicated, Lee was founding dean of the Carnegie School, and Jim Marsh was on that faculty. I'd like, Jim, for you to talk briefly about his role as founding dean and how some of the thoughts there transformed into what went on at Stanford and Lee's influence at Stanford, if you could.
Okay, I unlike the rest of you, I'm not prepared, so.
I understand. I'm not prepared either, so do not worry.
But, you know.
That's your advantage. You got, Jim,
That may
yeah.
be my advantage, so. I'm struck by the fact that this session is rapidly becoming a memorial session, and I want to join in that, because I first knew Lee when I went to Carnegie as a 25-year-old new hire. And I knew him all the time until he died as a fellow inmate of the same old folks home. So that's a long time and a lot of different experiences. But going back to GSIA, he created an intellectual atmosphere that I think well, I certainly have not experienced anywhere else subsequently. It was an extraordinary small group of faculty presided over by a very powerful trio, Herb Simon, Bill Cooper, Franco Moliani, and the fourth was Lee Bach. Lee was not part of the intellectual fire of that place, but he was the cause of the intellectual fire. He produced a world in which those people could survive. And I think it's not an accident that Lee, Bill Cooper, and Herb Simon were all products of the University of Chicago, of the Hutchins era of the University of Chicago. They had that kind of spark. And Franco was a product of Italy, and as we all know from the current president, Italians have a different way of living. But Lee was an extraordinary dean. He was, I always thought of him, I think correctly, as a Iowa banker. That was his heritage, and that was his style. He dressed like a banker, he talked like a banker, and he had all the kind of attributes that we associate with bankers. So, counter to what we all say, not everyone loved him. There were, in fact, people who hated his guts. I once told Lee that one of his faculty members was not entirely happy, and he said, "It's good for him." But I think that I can tell several stories about Lee that might give a clue as to his character. First story is, back in those days, hiring was not quite the same as it is now. Herb Simon came to New Haven, had dinner with me, and hired me at the end of the dinner. I'm told later he called Lee and said, "I've hired somebody," and I'm sure Lee said, "Good." That was the kind of dean he was. Very early after I joined the faculty, I was working one evening in my office, and I fell asleep. The next thing I knew, the door flew open, and there was Lee showing a visitor my office, a typical faculty office, in which the faculty member was sound asleep. They retreated, and I said, "Oh God, what do I do now?" Well, before I did anything, the next day, Lee called me and apologized. He said it was unforgivable of me to have gone into your office without knocking. And by the way, I'm delighted that you're working at night. That was his style. On another occasion, I was doing some experiments in which the subjects were asked, I was young, were asked to rate the beauty of female photograph, the females in these photographs. And these are all head and shoulder shots, and so it was all right. And I thought that in order to keep everything good, I should sort of get photos that were from a modeling company, so I got some. And of course there was a bill, and the bill came to Lee's office, and I got a telephone call. And he said, "I have a bill for, I don't know what it was, 30 photographs of female models. Do you know anything about this?" And I said, "Yes, they're for an experiment." He said, "Fine." That was his style. He was consistently a buffer between his faculty and the cruel outside world. Very early in my career, I gave a talk in which I made what was a relatively innocuous comment that said, from the point of view of classical theories of the firm, there's no essential difference between wages and dividends, which I think is correct. Well, it turned out that one of the persons in the audience was a major alumni supporter of Carnegie and wrote to the president saying, you have a man on your faculty who should be fired. He's obviously a communist. The president, who was Jake Warner, sent this down to Lee, and Lee called me in and said, I thought you ought to know that you're attracting attention among the alumni. And I said, well, what do we do? And he said, we laugh. That's what will happen to you often in your life, and you might just as well get used to it, and a good administrator protects you from that. And that's what he did. So that's the kind of person he was. As I say, that he wasn't absolutely loved, or, well, loved. He was feared. I had one colleague who would come over to our house and get as close to drunk as he could before he went to one of Lee's parties. Because he said, first, there won't be enough liquor, and second, Lee will say something bad. Well, I think Lee could be austere, he could be cold, but he was an enormously talented administrator and friend.
Okay, thank you, Jim. One offshoot of the long-range planning report that Chuck Horgan chaired was the establishment of a non-markets course. So often in business schools, we look at economic solutions and supply and demand curves and rigorous analysis. And this was a course in bringing to bear non-market considerations with respect to making a business decision. The course itself was called Business in the Changing Environment, really the social context of business that RJ touched upon. Lee was really the advocate of that course. He formulated it, he developed it, and he taught it. And this was very difficult subject matter to teach. Lee, using his Socratic method, brought that off, and it was a very popular course. It was a required course, but a very popular course, the way he taught it. And it brought to bear the enormous impact that this person had, or at least I thought he had, with respect to bringing some very social and practical considerations to business decisions of a number of different sorts. So I was very impressed with that. Also, he had an enormous effect upon the impact of teaching economics, not just at Stanford, but particularly nationwide. He took this on as a task, and he's very interested in development of new ideas with respect to how you could make economics, the subject matter, more relevant for students in the way professors taught. So that was a very important impact, as well as its impact on management education more broadly defined. So these are some of the things that have really evolved. My impressions, and I sat on the Dean's Advisory Council that RJ set up. I think, Chuck, you recommended that the Dean get more in touch with faculty and asked that the Dean's Advisory Group be established. That was your idea, not RJ's, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I listen to more than one good people. How do you think I got my reputation?
Well, I didn't want you to take
When
credit
you find
for
people
it.
smarter than you are, you delegate.
Yep. But Lee was, as RJ indicated, the permanent member of that committee, and I think we all deferred to him. You want to give some impressions?
One of the statements that he made one evening at our meeting, I've remembered, and he said it more than once in various contexts, but he said, I always try to hire somebody who's smarter than I am. And he cited Herb Simon and Bill Cooper as examples. They're pretty heady examples. And I always kept that in mind when interviewing rookie candidates and so on. And I think that advice is one that all hiring people should remember, because that improves the quality of the institution.
No.
One of the things I recall once telling Lee that one of my colleagues was a bastard, and he said, yes, but he's a smart bastard.
Yeah.
That was his attitude.
When Lee first talked to me, I said, Lee, you're looking for a fundraiser? Oh, no, Archie, we got all kinds of money. We want you to lead the faculty. Well, when I got here, as I found out, hell, all Jedicke and plus these two here knew so much more about it. I delegated almost to the point of abandonment and let them run the school. And then I went out with my tin cup and started raising money. I think they had 6 or 7 endowed chairs when I came here, and I got 19. The trick is to, as I said quickly earlier, to attract good people. I failed to mention, when I was at Ford, the best students, the MBA students, did not come from Harvard or Stanford or Carnegie or Chicago. I didn't. They came from Carnegie. Lee Bach, the educational process he installed there was the right one for to be successful managers. Now, they were mostly engineers, which I think added to the Ford situation, but he built up a curriculum that was just great for the kind of problem of getting good people in an organization.
One of the hallmarks of the R.J. Miller deanship was the public management program. I know Lee was involved with that with you.
Oh, yeah,
why don't you talk about that if you would?
That's really one of the reasons I came. I had this in mind that my mindset was when Lee arrived is business didn't understand government, government didn't understand business, and not enough was being done about it. Lee had already established this course, Business in the Changing Environment. It was not a core course. We made that after I came here, but Lee gave complete support to this public management idea, and it wasn't always fully supported. I won't mention the name, but you could be damn sure that there were a number of the old faculty people that didn't want to touch that thing. But with Lee's support and prestige, we just rolled through that, just ignored it. One professor come up and said, RJ, I want to warn you, you're listening to Lee too much. I said, go learn to like it. That's the way it's going to be.
I think that was true. Not that you listened to Lee too much, but that he had a powerful influence on the school. What will be his legacy with respect to management education, more broadly defined, do you think? Call on you to, all of you. Or what is his legacy would be the better.
Well, I told him once, he received some Dow Jones Award or whatever it was. It was another of his many distinctions. And I said to him, you know, I can't think of one person who had more of an impact on business education in the whole century, the 20th century. And I still feel that, not only because of his emphasis on economics and the contributions he made through his writings in economics, but also because of his enormous influence on a lot of creative people. And I think that's his one way of expressing his legacy.
Lee was never one to brag, but he did have pride in one area, and that is the influence that he was having on the teaching of economics and management education. I've heard him mention it. His textbook went through 11 editions, and he said, I think I've influenced millions of people. And he got some satisfaction out of that. He was essentially a teacher. You say he was a banker. In my mind, he was a teacher. He really knew how to teach. He had all these other skills. He was a pure intellectual, in my mind, but an intellectual that also was pragmatic. Seldom you get this combination that as smart as he is. He could play I used to go to the academic center and see these academic people. I don't consider myself an academic, by the way, and neither did all the people around me. I was just a businessman that happened to fall into a situation. But the university professors have a name, I call it gotcha. You know, they want to prove, even if they don't agree, they want to prove their intellectual superiority. They will spar back and forth. And I've seen Lee get in one of these. And he would practice this and practice that and ask over there. And all of us, he just pounced. This guy just be completely demolished. And next time around, he was sure he was going to get on Lee's side before he got in one of these arguments. Lee was just great at that. It was very, very satisfying for me to observe.
Lee was certainly very rigorous and in intellectual arguments could really skewer opponents that were faulty in their thinking. But another dimension that I remember quite vividly was in the riots of the early 1970s over the Vietnam War, where, as RJ indicated, not only was his window to his office broken, but I think probably 30 to 40% of all the windows in the GSB South, which is the only building we occupied at that time, were broken. Students in the MBA program joined other students and really going on strike. And we had various meetings set up. I was director of the MBA program at that point. Meetings set up to try to come to a little better understanding of the student concerns. There were faculty that, and I won't mention their names, but who essentially wanted to lock the students out, close the place down, bring in the police to effectively protect the school. Lee listened to these arguments and was much more understanding that this was a social change in society. This was a very important incident. The Vietnam War, it has created a lot of unrest in our society. And despite his hard-nosed approach to academic rigor, really was sympathetic to the arguments being raised and tried to understand them in ways that I thought were quite remarkable. I remember sitting next to him at a meeting of students, more broadly defined, but a lot of business school students in Memorial Church, and his emphasis on caution, that we have to understand where their arguments are, and that we need to understand this is perhaps the most important social issue of the day, and we would be remiss if we didn't at least look at it from the standpoint of the students in the more broadly based national movement.
Jim, I knew Dennis Hayes in those days, who was at one time one of the presidents of the student body and an activist, and continues to be an activist. And I recall a conversation with him in which he was very unhappy with a lot of the faculty and administrators at Stanford, saying you cannot trust them. They do not tell you the truth. But he said one does. It was Lee Bach.
I want to reinforce that. One of them told me that Lee's a conservative, but he's a good guy. You can trust him and believe him. And that, you know, that was not easy in those days to carry that reputation. He was just an amazing skill that he had with interpersonal relationships. No one else like him.
We had in the school in the 1970s sort of various types of objective function, I guess, and it revolved around a term called balanced excellence. And Lee was very much involved in that. I'd like to get your impressions, as well as yours, Jim, upon that dimension and how he forwarded that concept. And
Well,
either one of you.
A little louder, Chuck.
I'm not sure
Oh, I'll take
I
it.
grasp.
Well, there
trade-offs
are lots of
between-
ways to build a school. You could have a star, you know, build on one or two stars, pay enormous salaries, and then they suck out all the money from the school. Lee was balanced excellence. We got to be good in everything across the board. And I recall we tried that, and to show you the kind of success we had, I recall we'd have a retreat once a year and bring all of the faculty out and go to the woods somewhere and have them. We called it a bitch session because we encouraged the professors to complain. They were always complaining. You ask them about the parking, the heating, the location, and so forth. And at this particular time, I had invited the president to join for lunch. He always had declined, but this time he said yes. And just before he was about to arrive, I said, look, we're going to take a time out here because the president's coming over. And I want you to get this kind of mindset. First, we were just voted #1 school in the country in 1975. The next year, we were even most improved school. And of the 6 fields that we had, in those days, the deans of the business schools all voted. We had AACSB that voted what's the best school. So the deans were the best one, but they thought Stanford had passed Harvard, which was of course the best school by far, I think, before recognized with that reputation at least. I said, we've just not only voted best school, but in every field, in economics, industrial relations, marketing. Marketing was the one field that we were not #1 on. I got Dave Montgomery and told him, this is your problem. And the next year he told me we were hiring an assistant prof, and there were 2 good ones coming off the pipeline. One difference between academia and business. In business, it's hard to find out who the good people are so you can hire them. But in academia, they all know who the good people are because they go to these watering places and the associations and they talk. And usually when they have a good graduate student getting his PhD, they don't want to hire him, they'll put him out on the market. So this year there were 2 great, absolutely first-rate students coming out, and both Harvard and Stanford were in the market for an assistant prof in marketing. And Dave Montgomery told me, he says, his Harvard told him, Stanford, make up your mind, because both of them prefer to come to Stanford, and we don't want to be turned down. So you pick the guy, and then you go otherwise. Well, anyway, Lee had this balance. You got to have good ones across the board, and we were able to achieve that because his knowledge, through his Ford Foundation consulting and all the rest, he ran this Federal Reserve Advisory Board. He would he knew everybody, and he would put up on the board first, second, and third. We always got our top people, and that was just part of the balanced excellence that he didn't want to have any one part of the school overpower the other.
There was another aspect that deserves mentioning, I think, is he was not only unhappy with the status quo all the time, always looking for improvement. But, for example, another area that was not our strongest suit was strategic planning or business policy or whatever you want to label it. And he was chairing one committee after the other, recruiting prospects for that particular course. And I remember I was on that committee with him, and it was not a very satisfactory outcome again and again until we found, I may be wrong, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the one person who sort of turned it around was Garth Saloner, our new dean.
I think that is true. So in the balanced excellence, it was a trade-off between research and teaching, the trade-off between non-markets and market-oriented type courses, the trade-off between economics and behavioral, people from an economic base, which finance is, versus behavioral, those type of trade-offs. And Lee, in his own way, was very important in sort of nudging the school sort of toward the middle, it seems to me, under most of those arguments. It's a equilibrium that's very difficult to maintain, but one that needs to be looked at. And I always was impressed with how he was able to tilt things and bring out arguments on all sides to kind of keep us on not necessarily an even keel, but at least a direction that we knew what we were doing and not allowing one side to sort of capture the other side. Very difficult. Yale, presently in their school, has great difficulty in maintaining that balance.
I was reading in this magazine that I referred to earlier some excerpts from Herb Simon, who was commenting on Lee Bach, and he has extensive comments on Lee Bach, not only in there, but in Simon's autobiography. But one of the things that he said about Bach was he never lost sight that a business school should be practical enough so that everything practically that it did should relate to improving business practice or management practice. And he commented that, Simon that is, commented that Lee was not strong in quantitative methods as such, yet he overseed the flourishing of quantitative methods as it relates to business at Carnegie. And I think that is an example of how Lee felt in terms of the breadth of his views as to what education is all about.
You know, I think it's absolutely true. He is a balanced person, and worried about positive feedback loops in the development of school. But the overriding thing with Lee, I think, was the faculty. You construct the smartest, the best faculty you could get, then everything else will fall in place. And he worried about that all the time. When I was being recruited to come to Stanford, I got a call from Lee. He said, "I've just seen the guest list for the dinner they held for you to recruit you, and I want, before you make a decision, please come back and I'll give you a dinner with people who are much more interested." And he did. He was absolutely right. For various political reasons, this particular dinner was not a good recruiting dinner. And he saw it, and he acted, and I'm not sure I would have come without that kind of intervention, which no one asked for, and he was just monitoring the efficiency of the university.
He also, Jim is from the behavioral area, but Lee was instrumental in sort of, not shifting, but directing the school a little more toward the behavioral side. There was this trade-off of people primarily from economics background, including finance, accounting, and I think our behavioral faculty, organizational behavior faculty in the sort of the late 1960s was 4 or 5 members. And if you ask a person in finance if they thought that was a sufficient number, they'd say, well, it's far too many. So, but Lee did not agree with that and felt that the shift toward behavioral and implementation of decisions was very, very important to Lee. Not just sort of the best analysis, evaluating the alternatives that go into a decision and reaching a decision, but once you reached a decision, implementing it, and the implementation had to be through people. So Lee was a champion in his own quiet but fairly resolute way of increasing our presence really in the behavioral area and our organization behavior faculty. Maybe we could take a small pause now to bring Bob Joss in, if we could. Yep.
Old has-been Joss. Sorry, Bob.
Bob had an earlier commitment in behalf of the school, and Bob is the 8th dean of the Graduate School of Business. RJ is the 4th, so we have them seated side by side without any intervening deans. But you're aware of the agenda today as Lee, and perhaps you could give us some impressions. We've all given our impressions, brought out anecdotal evidence on certain dimensions, but
it's a pleasure. I have some rather unique perspectives on Lee that perhaps none of you have, because I was a student in his class, and I don't know how many of you ever sat in Lee's class as a student where he was a teacher. We know him so well for all he did for management education and for this incredible revolution that took place in the 50s and 60s. I was reviewing the history, and I didn't realize he came here in '66, so I must have been one of the first MBA students who was fortunate to have him in class. He was far and away the best teacher I had at the GSB, and I had some great ones. You know, I had Van Horn, I had I had Robichek, I had Solomon, I had some great
You have
teachers.
Holmgren?
No, I didn't have Horngren,
You're
so I can't compare, Chuck. But Lee was fantastic. I mean, I had him for this MBA class that is probably the closest thing today to the CAT seminar, in a way. It was business and government and the changing society. He just pushed us, and I was in it. This was an MBA class I was in, even though I was a PhD student. He pushed us to take a view on a difficult social, economic, business issue and to write a very crisp, well-crafted, short paper, no more than 3 pages. The punchline was usually, what's the role of the businessman in this issue? And he was really tough-minded in his critique, lots of, you know, cross-outs, red markings, questions in the margin. I think I not only learned how to think from Lee, how to write from Lee. It was a tremendous experience as a student. So that's a kind of unique vantage point, being one of the very first MBA students here, now being the dean years later, and knowing, of course, his tremendous impact on the evolution of management education and what it did here at Stanford. But to be a student in his class was phenomenal. I also, amazingly enough, as an undergraduate at the University of Washington, you know, I didn't even know what economics was. I took my very first course in economics, which just excited me and opened my eyes to the field. And the textbook, of course, was Lee's textbook, and I always remember that as well. The faculty member brought it alive, but he also had this great lucid quality of making economics interesting.
Yes.
Comment on that, because
No, of course.
I shared that.
Please.
I was in the class of 1968,
Mm-hmm.
and had the good fortune of taking, Lee's class. And the one thing I will always vividly remember is after our first written assignment was submitted, he came into the class and just shocked us all by saying, "You all are terrible writers." And I mean, I was really shocked. I was shocked to the extent that I went out and went constructively to improve my writing skills, and in the process I find out I like to write, and it ended up affecting, I continually now publish, which also gets me invited to interesting places to do workshops and things like that, and I trace it all back to that shocking revelation that I had never heard that before, that I was not a prolific writer, and I attribute that to Lee. It made a positive impact on my life.
You're sparking another point that he made the same point in our class. Well, I'm shocked at the quality of writing here. He said that, and I didn't realize now this was his first year. He said, well, I'd come to the Stanford Business School. I expected better. I expected more. And he had these high expectations, which were great. I mean, that's what you want in a classroom. And he just hit people right between the eyes. Look, this is the Stanford Business School. I expect a certain level of performance, of to express yourself, of rigor, of supporting your points with good, solid, well-constructed arguments, and here's what they look like. And your paper would just be a mess, you know, when you thought you'd really worked hard and done a good job, but boy, did we learn how to write.
Jim, you're the moderator, but I'm 93 years old, and I can exercise my seniority.
Absolutely.
And I want to say I thought it was very nice we got a response from the audience. I hope someone from the Bach family will speak up about your dad. I think I could keep on talking, but I've already talked too much. But if any of you would be inclined to, or anybody around here, just
That's
hang
a good
loose
idea,
on this
RJ.
thing. I think that was a very nice comment, and
I don't know if there are other microphones.
I particularly would like to hear the family's assessment of Ruth Bach, their mother, because I always felt that she was a very strong support for Lee, and I just wondered about it since I never did know the children.
to give you a minute to collect your thoughts, I'll say a few words. My wife did all same training I had. She taught at UCLA while I first got drafted, and so we saw quite a bit of the Bachs. They were supportive in a social sense, and she had a very high regard for Ruth. And I said, Franz, what should I say today? She said, well, first of all, bring Ruth into the picture somewhere. That's why I mentioned it, and good judgment. And then I said, well, what should I say about Lee? She said, well, say he was thoughtful. They would have exchanges. She would and talk about economics. And then Lee would say something, and then she'd remember that. And then if I said something else, well, Lee says this. How dumb can you be? Because Lee said the other. Well, anyway, now come on back, and this whoever wants to be the spokesman for the family, you got to say something here about your father and grandfather.
Yeah, my father, to me, was very intellectual and very fair, very intellectual. I learned to write also from him. I remember the scribbling on the paper. But he was very helpful, and his love was economic education. You know, I think you hit the nail on that. I mean, the head on the nail, whatever. And I remember sort of being a guinea pig for some of his new ideas and education, especially even going down to the high school level, trying to create a program where students could learn to remember economics.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of studies. And that article, you know, my mother was right, that article in that magazine there, I learned so much about what my father did because he didn't talk about it at home very much.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he'd go in his study, he knew about his textbook and his writings.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't bother him when he was in that study. But his personal life was his personal life, and his business life was sort of out there. And it's sort of the same way with my mother. You know, she was a very private person, very shy,
Mm-hmm.
but very
Mm-hmm.
supportive.
Mm-hmm.
And she would help him with his books and stuff. But she was not a public person particularly. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just so delighted to hear all about my dad here, and so many of the things you say resonate with my memories back with all of you. And Dad did share some, maybe a little bit more with me about what he was doing. I think the same as Susie, that we all read his textbooks. We were used as guinea pigs for his textbooks, and he'd give us a chapter to read and then quiz us about what we learned, and then use that to make some corrections and do whatever he needed to do in his book. As far as the writing, that certainly resonates well too. I remember having to present my papers to him in high school, and he said, well, Tim, this isn't so good, and you realize this, and what do you really mean? He always did it with questions, which I thought was a really great strength of his. I went to Stanford undergrad here, and I had friends who took his classes, the Intro to Economics classes, and they all come back and say, oh, your dad's just so great. It's the questions. He makes us think about what we're doing and what we're thinking. He makes us clear thinkers. I think another thing that strikes me is he talked about when he was a young man in Iowa, I went to Grinnell, and he shared his thoughts about how he was affected by the Depression years and how he used that as an impetus. And so that's what got me interested in this field of economics and educating people, educating everybody about how economic systems work, and that led to his first textbooks, I know. You mentioned the inflation book. I remember him sitting and writing the inflation book and saying, Tim, now this is what inflation is, and this is what this is all about, and trying to engender my interest in the field too, I know. I went a completely different direction in my field, but I know he also had an impact on my older brother, who got his PhD in economics and is working high up in the Treasury Department now. But what's so wonderful for me here, for my family too, is all these wonderful remembrances. And it brings back.
You didn't have to be an economist. He was proud of your musical.
He was indeed.
Did he ever speculate as to what he would have done had he not gone into academia?
He turned down law. Didn't he start the law school for a while, turned his back on that?
And he hated the law.
The famous story was he tried law school for one semester in Texas.
Yeah.
And he didn't like law. He didn't like Texas.
I always thought of him as a tough
I thought
lawyer who I would not want to cross-examine me in a courtroom.
Yeah.
This reminds, I was on the Harvard Visiting Committee. I knew what they were doing. And during the interim year, when I was waiting to come, they asked me to speak to the AACSB. That was the Association of All the Deans. And I know in my speech, I made the comment, it's okay to look back. I said, the case method is basically looking backward. I said, it's okay to look backward, but you shouldn't look backward over half of the time. And one of the Harvard professors came up and tried to turn me around. I said, no, I'm not changing you. We're going to look forward. We're not going to look backward. So I know why Lee didn't like the law. He was a forward-looking guy.
Yeah, well put.
He looked in all directions.
Yeah.
I also want to share a little bit about my mother, too. Through all his illness, she really was the strength behind him. Well, she was very private. That really held us as a family together, and especially supported him through all this.
My wife, Mimi, was involved in music and was very close to Ruth, and that was clear towards the end that Ruth's role in this, she was
I would
very
say
important.
something just by happenstance that I knew about your father and mother. I didn't really know her, but I, of course, went on to work at Wells Fargo Bank, and ultimately Lee called me rather late in his life to make sure that the trust, we were involved in his own personal estate and trust, and that things, he was very concerned that things would be right for Ruth and right for your mother, and it made quite an impression on me just how much he cared and how interested he was, and it meant a lot to me as a former student to just be able to help him with that.
I remember when Bob mentioned the papers that Lee required and how attached he was to rigor and analysis. In the early 70s, I was director of the MBA program, and unlike today where we have 8 or 10 people involved in student affairs, I was the sole person involved in student affairs and adjudicated any problems. One student came in with a paper that he got a B- grade from Lee on this paper. It had writing all over it. It was all in red. The student never had a B in his life before, either at undergraduate or in Stanford Business School, and was irate by this. And I looked over the paper and I said, so what? He said, well, this is an insult. He said, I've just never had this. And at the bottom of the paper was the statement by Lee, this paper is too good not to be better. That was the closing, B-. And I said, this is the greatest accolade you could have. I said, you ought to be proud of this. You ought to frame this. I thought that Lee at his best.
Yeah, that's very good.
Okay, further reflections on Lee? Any concluding remarks we want to make? We've said a lot. Yes. Yes, indeed.
Can you come a little closer up so we can all hear?
Yeah, you might just stand so the cameras can pick you up your, yeah.
Question. What do you think he would say right now about the state of management education? If he saw it and in the spirit which you've spoken about him this morning, what do you think he would say about the current teaching and curriculum?
My impression would be that he'd be very pleased. And the key behind it is change. That Lee was never for a static organization or a static business goal. I think the change would be important. The fact that balanced excellence to a degree has carried forward would be pleasing to him. The emphasis on societal concerns, I think, would be heartening to him. Those are my off-the-cuff remarks. Please.
Well, I think they're right on target. As I mentioned earlier, I thought Lee was, of all the individuals who have contributed to business education in that century, Lee stood at the top. And to give him that acclaim, I think, is not only justified, but it says everything about his strong suits.
In a way, that was almost his long suit, recognizing that external conditions changed and business had to adjust to these external conditions. And while we're at this is a memorial to Lee, but I didn't get to attend Bob's retirement kind of a party, and wrote him a nice letter, I think. But I want to say in front of, I think you've done a hell of a good job as being dean of the business school. I think you be remembered, and it's not an easy job running. Well, I know what you're talking about, keeping the balance in there. But you're leaving a legacy of the new curriculum and the new campus. And I said in my letter to you, I think that over the next few years, Stanford will come to be recognized as the best business school in the world. And when I heard that Garth got the job, I mailed him a letter this morning, I think he was absolutely the right choice. You're in a transitional mode now with this changes in the curriculum, and you got to see it through. There are going to be adjustments every time. You never get it right the first time. You got to keep fine-tuning this thing. But what the track you're on is the right track, and you set the track, and you can take a lot of credit. And I'm glad I could say this in front of these people because I did.
Well, thank you very much, RJ. And of course, when you have a job like this, you try to think, well, how would others that you respect have done it? And I'll have to say that a lot of that goes to obviously people like Ernie and yourself and Lee and Jim Howell and Jim Van Horn and Bob Jedicke and Chuck Horngren. It's just it's in the DNA here. You want it to be that kind of place. I think Lee would be very pleased today with the role of the business school in the university and the respect that it enjoys at a great university, because I think that was always something that he felt from the 50s was missing, that business schools belonged really in a major, respected, prominent role in a leading university. But I think he'd be challenging us. He'd be troubled by some of the things going on in society, the lack of business leadership in some situations. I think he'd be taking that course on business government and the changing society and really pushing our students even harder about what's the role of business leadership in the world today, the social concerns, and if business doesn't get involved in the way they ought to, who else? And that would be his big push. That's what he would expect of Stanford MBA students, and he's right.
I agree. He asked me, he came out of the blue one day and said, when I was teaching, I said, what are you going to do on Earth Day? And I said, what do you mean? I teach finance. What about Earth Day? I don't know what you're talking about. And Lee then laid out what he was going to do in his course on economics, business and changing environment, with saying, I'm going to use this to sort of capture the ideas of these trade-offs and how society should judge these trade-offs. It was remarkable. I just couldn't believe it. And it made me think, well, what can I do? And I actually then, in the course I taught, referred to Earth Day. The students were quite surprised. But nonetheless, it was a remarkable stimulus. So he'd be current today, I think, as he was then.
I think he had this remarkable ability to care about business as a well-run organization and all that we do as a school to really help our students in the micro level to, what do you do to make sure an organization runs really well? But he was so good at looking to the external and bringing the external into the firm. And if you're responsible for a firm, you're operating in society and you're operating in a larger economy, and you've got to take that responsibility as well as just inwardly looking at the firm.
He was very curious about what you were doing in research, which I found, I forget whether it was Jim March or Bill Cooper who told me that that Lee would come around on Saturday mornings and go from office to office.
Saturday morning.
Pardon?
GSIA, everyone was there on Saturday morning, also Sunday morning.
Okay.
It was
But
not
and he'd rap on your door and ask you what you're doing, and that creates fear.
Or inspiration, Chuck.
You wonder how Lee found time to do all of these things. You think all the time he was outside pushing other people. Hell, he was the best listener I ever knew. He'd listen to you. How did he have time to do all of this and yet doing all the forcing? He must have led. He must have had two lives somehow. get all this done.
No sleep, maybe.
And he listened in nice ways. He wasn't judgmental. He just had questions that mostly seemed to be curiosity, but he was always pushing toward more rigor. I expect his legacy will be one in management education of bringing business schools into increased rigor. I expect that's the thing I remember most about him. All right, any further reflections? Paul, I think I should turn it back to you. We thank all of you for coming, and particularly the family. Gosh, it's been wonderful for us. We're
Thank you,
privileged to have
Jim,
known him and proud of his legacy very much in the business school.
Thanks for leading, Jim.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming today. Thanks to our film crew, GSC Media Services, for producing this film. We're going to attempt to put this up on the business school website so that everybody can see it. Kathy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add that I think we all owe Paul a great debt of gratitude.
Yes, indeed.
His idea, he brought this together, he got all four of these incredibly busy people in one place at one time, and I have my offices across the hall, so I know how difficult this is going to be, and I think he's done a wonderful job.
Yes, indeed.
Deserves an
Hear, hear.
Last but not least, our panel. This panel has been tremendous, and I really appreciate taking the time out of your schedules to come and talk about this important person in the history of the school. I think this has really added to the historical material that we can use for the future, for future researchers to actually draw upon. So thank you again. I'm going to give them.
Thank you.